excited for you to join us today for this session called Culture Sprint. Culture Sprint at this time is going to be part of the Creative Challenge series brought to you by LSE Generate, Manifesta and LSE Cities. It's actually part of 4 sessions this week, which you are more than welcome to join any and all of them. So we'd love you to come back for the ones tomorrow, Wednesday and Thursday as well. All of that is on the LSE listings that you would have used to find today's sessions. So please do join us for those sessions as well. So just as a recap about what we're going to be doing today, we are here because we want to deep dive into visions for participatory design, specifically with communities. We're interested in interdisciplinary approaches, so we'll be covering that today. And we're really sort of driven by this idea of the legacy of cities as a force for social cohesion. So kind of big ideas today, which we're going to be working on some specific, very user-friendly tools to help us unpick those. The idea with the Culture Sprint specifically is a very interactive workshop. It's designed to bring together peers, so that anyone in the room today sort of bringing together your ideas, your thoughts, as well as sort of inspirational experts that we bring in to talk to you. So we will be introducing our fantastic expert today, Madeleine Kessler, in a moment. We also believe that these sessions will really help to show the power of SHAPE subjects, so SHAPE meaning social sciences, arts and humanities, the power of those subjects in stimulating innovative thinking and forward-thinking solutions. So we very much designed this session so that we can work together to think about what a fresh solution might be to an ongoing challenge. We're going to be using a mix of design thinking, which I'm going to explain a little bit more about in a moment, also with the ideas that Madeleine has developed in her practice, and of course your own ideas and experience, in order to collectively define some specific actions that we think might be helpful for you to help you innovate and collaborate back in your own work and lives. So it's very much designed to be a discussion. We have these tools that we're going to work through with you to solve a specific challenge today, but it's very much about freeing yourselves from sort of day-to-day concerns, specifics. We're going quite big and quite creative this morning. So I hope you're ready, and we're very, very pleased to have you with us. So to start off with, I am going to introduce our wonderful guest speaker, Madeleine. I don't know if you just can wave at the screen so people can see you, Madeleine, and we'll be coming to you shortly. So Madeleine Kessler is co-founder of Unseen Architecture and director of MKA. She trained as an architect and as a structural engineer. She's got over a decade of experience, specifically working on civic, cultural and master planning projects. So some of the examples are the Battersea Arts Centre, the big refurbishment there, Theatre Drury Lane, Oslo's City Airport, which I really want to hear a little bit more about. And more recently, Madeleine is co-curator of the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennial this year. And her exhibition is called The Garden of Privatized Delights, and it specifically explores privatized public spaces across the UK and really thinks about inclusive ownership, access and use. But I'll leave Maddie to explain more about that because she is the expert. So thank you, Madeleine, for joining us today. We'll be passing to you in just a moment. So before we get going, I did just want to kind of run through some specifics. And like I said, at any point, if you've got a question, either pop it in the chat or raise your hand using the tool or actually physically with your hand. If we're mid-flow, we'll come back to you shortly, but very much feel free to dive in and ask questions at any time. So we're going to kick off with a creative icebreaker. It's not as scary as it sounds. It's just a moment to kind of be a bit friendly and creative together. So we'll explain in a moment what that's going to be. We're then going to have a conversation with Madeleine to hear a bit more specifically about her work. We're then going to go into the challenge section. So the challenge is going to be our work together. We will go into breakout rooms very briefly for about sort of 15 minutes just to get some sort of more ideas together before we come back and we really work as a group to discuss those thoughts, your solutions to the challenge, and then try and pin those down into some specific actions. And it's going to be about an hour and 45 minutes today. So if at any point you need to just turn off your microphone, turn off your screen and just pop out, feel free. We don't have a break, so we won't take it personally. If you just need to quickly go and get a glass of water or respond to a phone call, feel free just to quickly pop yourselves on mute and come back when you're ready. One thing I did want to sort of flag specifically is that we really want to encourage collaboration and for you to feel free to speak completely freely. We've deliberately design these sessions so that they can work for anyone. So it doesn't matter what your background is, where you're studying, what you work on, what your discipline is. It's really specifically designed to bring those different people together to get lots of different ideas flowing. And everyone is equal, and we want to hear from everybody. Obviously, if you want to contribute more or less, that's completely fine. That's up to you. But it's very much about sort of unlocking different ideas and how you might actually help one another with your own experiences. So that's a kind of key principle today. Another thing that we did want to flag is that today is not just about today. So really this is about how we can use the learnings that we all bring together today to pull together a toolkit that then can help you beyond the sessions, but also can help other people. And really amplifying what we discussed today and the learnings from Madeleine and the tools that we use in order to make this a useful vehicle for people solving challenges in all different areas and disciplines. So there is much more beyond today's session, and we're really excited that you're part of it. Some of you might have spotted it that in the document in the Eventbrite that we sent you, there was a sort of preparation document about design thinking. And some of you may well be designers and know about this, but I just wanted to take a moment just to quickly recap on some key principles that we thought would be really helpful for today's session. So for those that aren't familiar with design thinking, this is essentially the process that designers go through. I'm actually a cultural practitioner, so I've worked in museums and theatres. I have learned from designers how to use this process. And for me, it was very exciting because some of it seems almost a little obvious, but actually you never are challenged to really follow this process and sort of give yourself and your teams and your colleagues freedom to follow a process like this. So the idea of a design sprint, I've started using in my work, and I believe it's incredibly useful for lots of different disciplines. And this is the basic program that a design sprint would go through. So you very much would always need to start with empathy, really putting yourselves in the shoes of the people that you were designing for, or whichever discipline it is, whatever solution you are trying to come up with, it has to start with empathy for the people that will actually use it. You then need to be specific. You have to define a challenge, a problem to solve. And it might actually be that there are a ton of problems to solve, but you need to park some of them until later and just focus on one for now. Then comes a freedom moment, which is the bit I love, and actually is what we'll be covering mostly today. So it's about ideation. It's about going big and bold with any idea you can come up with that would solve that solution right now. We often use techniques of trying to think of extremes, sort of challenging yourself to think about what you would do if you were in charge of the whole project, or if budget was no problem, just going really, really big. And then what a designer would do is then very quickly try and get that into something you could prototype. So rather than spending too long on lots of consultation and sort of trying to get to the perfect answer, it's very much about throwing yourself in, making a prototype, getting out there and testing it on the audience, and then testing again and coming back through the process. So the process doesn't really end. It's a kind of ongoing process in order to get to something that will help you right now and start building a longer term solution. But actually, it's as long as you've tried it and your audience are embracing it, then you are in a really good position. So this is the general process that a designer would go through. And these are the principles that I think we should all remember today. So specifically, freeing yourself from your current focus. So whatever stress is on your plate right now, whatever project you're about to go on to immediately after this session, try and put that to one side for the next hour and 45 minutes. Try and just focus on what we're talking about here, and it gives you a little bit more freedom and room to think. It's important to remember that absolutely nothing is a bad idea, nothing at all. There might be moments where we go on a bit of a tangent, and just purely because of time, I might have to park a really great idea and just say, why don't you take that offline and talk about it, or why don't we come back to that? But nothing is a bad idea, so please just feel free to share and go with your gut instinct as much as you can. Challenging assumptions sounds obvious, but it's actually sort of more about your own assumptions. So if you've got that gut instinct, that's brilliant. But if someone's gut instinct is different to yours, maybe think about where your perspective has come from. Where has that idea been rooted? What would happen if you did the opposite? So sort of challenge your own assumptions, but but then importantly, bringing in this last point, which is to be optimistic. So even if somebody has a perspective or an assumption that maybe you don't agree with, because we want to embrace that idea of nothing being a bad idea, and also we really want to be as optimistic as possible in order to unlock those new ideas, that's where just be as realistically optimistic and positive about other people's ideas as you can be, and that will move you forward. The point at which you start putting ideas to bed is later on. That's when you get to the testing. So that's why we try and be as optimistic as possible. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. If anyone has any quick questions before we get going, just wave at me and I'll come to you. No, you'll look pretty happy. This is great. Okay, fantastic. So we are going to work on a bit of a creative icebreaker. So Madeleine has inspired me today. Maddie, what is it that you like to do in your spare time? When I asked you, what's a creative thing you like to do?
I love making collages, as you can see in my background, but also I just find they're a brilliant way just to kind of unwind and come up with. I find it's really interesting, the accidental moments that they force you to come up with, and they can really inspire sort of different forms of design going forward.
Very nice. And I like this actually because it's not something I've really ever practiced with. And Madeleine sort of then set me a challenge. I was thinking, how on earth can I do this on a Zoom? How can we do collage together? And obviously, if we were all in a room together, I'd be hauling out loads of pieces of paper at this point. What I thought we'd do, just as a kind of fun exercise, and also because we're a smaller group today, which is great because we can do some really good work together. If you're comfortable, what we'll do is also ask you to sort of introduce yourselves as we go through this process, just so you know, we all know who's in the room, what you focus on, what's brought you here today. So the way that I think we can do an online collage is that what I want to ask you to do is to grab anything around you that maybe just brings a spark of joy or a spark of inspiration. So it can be as simple as a bunch of Post-its. I've got a bunch of Post-its here. I've also just found a kitchen bowl, which I thought was kind of snazzy. And what we can do is across our screens, we can make a virtual collage, because simply by holding something up to the camera, or it could be as simple as making a kind of cool shape that you like, maybe a big fan of, something trying to focus on your face. We can just have a moment where we try and create a collage together. And what I will try and do is try and take a snapshot of it that we can send around each other afterwards, but it sort of depends what we have to hand. So have a quick look around you, what's on your desk, what could you use? It could be brilliant pineapple, came prepared. That's excellent. It could be your glasses if you've just got your glasses. It could be absolutely anything. So everyone have a go and get ready. I'm going to get my screen grab. I'm loving the small cup. That is brilliant. I like the angle that you've chosen. It's kind of very center screen. That's great. So let me get my camera up and ready. Oh, that's a lovely flower. Thank you so much. Okay, and also if you don't want, you could just turn your background and have a different background. So everyone got something inspirational to hand. That's excellent, Berlin. Hold on, we've lost one person, so we have an unwilling participant in the background there. Excellent. Okay, brilliant. So everyone just hold up to your screen, and then I will 3, 2, 1 capture. Everyone take a moment to look around at your peers and what they've come up with. Got our beautiful collage. Fantastic. Thank you so much for being willing guinea pigs in our collage moment. I will just quickly whiz around the room. If you could just introduce yourself, what you do, why you're here today, just super quickly, just so we can meet each other. I will just go around one at a time. And if you can also please tell me how to correctly pronounce your name, just to make sure I don't say it incorrectly, that would be fantastic. Well, Madeleine, why don't we kick you off? Why are you here today, Madeleine?
So I'm Madeleine or Maddie. And I have to say, I think this sounds like an incredible program. I'm super interested in sort of multidisciplinary design. I'm an architect and structural engineer by background, as Kate said, and I'm really looking forward to sort of developing ideas together. I think often sort of the design and architecture industry can be too insular, and it's really important to kind of broaden our horizons. And I'm really looking forward to getting to know you all.
Thank you so much. Next on my screen, I've got Bora.
Hi everyone, I'm Bora. I just finished my master's in social entrepreneurship at LSE, and I'm here for ideas.
Ideas, okay, that's excellent. Thank you. Next on my screen, I've got Sekar.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Sekar. I'm from Indonesia. It's pronounced Sekar.
Sekar.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I'm currently an undergraduate architecture student, and I'm here to learn. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Matthew, can I pass to you next?
Hi, I recently graduated from University of Kent from my undergraduate, and yeah, I guess I'm just here to learn. Yeah.
Thanks, Matthew. Next, I have Rasha. You there, Rasha?
Yes.
Hi. Do you mind just letting us know who you are, what you do, what brings you here today?
I'm landscape architect and a lecturer at the university, at Arts University in Tehran, from Iran. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us. Next on my screen, I have Daman.
Hi everyone, I'm Daman, and I'm just starting a master's at LSE in gender studies, media and culture, and I also run a blog/online magazine which looks at South Asia through the lens of through a gender lens, and we use a lot of art on the magazine. So this is a really interesting space for me to learn more about art and learn about multidisciplinary approaches to problem solving. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And next on my screen I have Kwame. Oh, can I unmute you? Sorry.
Yes. Hello. My name is Kwame. By training, I'm a lawyer. But recently I started a consultancy to give social ventures the insight and the tools to grow. And today I'm just here just to learn, just to learn a different way of thinking from the way that I'm actually used to. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, it's so interesting to just have this mix of backgrounds. You're bringing law to the table as well. That's fab. Thank you so much. Sean, I pass to you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm a sort of social scientist, I suppose. I work with universities, but largely within the cultural sector as well, both in the UK and the Netherlands and Africa, mainly in Nigeria and South Africa. So yeah, so just really interested to sort of see like how interdisciplinary approaches can break down some barriers and increase kind of, how we engage communities and how we get people to participate in the futures that we want to build.
Thank you, Sean. And last but not least, Zeni.
Hi, my name is Jenny. I just finished Master's in Social Policy at LSE. I've always been into social sciences and also art. I was about to study architecture and then I went into social sciences. So I'm always interested how we can use design and spaces to give solutions to social causes. So I'm really enjoying the session.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, everybody. I think I've got round everyone. Looks like it. Really, really fantastic to have you all here today. And this is exactly what we want, is lots and lots of different disciplines, stages of careers, perspectives, backgrounds. This is what's fantastic about this kind of a session, because it just means we can have lots and lots of different ideas together. So I will now move on to a chat with Madeleine. At any point, if you've got questions as we're talking, please just put it in the chat, put your hand up. This is all so you can hear a little bit more about her work, and it will set the context for the challenge that we're then going to do together shortly. So Madeleine, thank you so much again for being here. I am flying straight in from Venice to be with us first thing this morning, because you've been over there looking after your brilliant pavilion, which I cannot wait to go and see. Can you tell us, I mean, maybe that example, maybe another one, but can you just tell us about a recent project that you've worked on that you think defines the way that you work?
Oh, sure. Hey, yeah. Sorry. Also, just fascinating to meet you all. Like, what an incredible group of people we have here today. Yeah, if I share my screen, perhaps, because I have a few slides which might help sort of just expand a little bit more on my background and work. So yeah, I suppose so what I'm really interested in, and I've been exploring for a number of years now, is the kind of evolution of our cities. And this is a collage I made when I was a student studying my diploma project, and I was looking at the kind of evolution of the city and how, as cities evolve, they sort of both destroy. There's this fine boundary, I suppose, between destruction and evolution of a city, and what is the architect's role within that? You know, when we're building a new building, are we actually destroying a city? And there's sort of these constant, very fine lines that we're treading. And that's something I've sort of continued to explore in my work. And I think something I love about architecture and design is it is this conversation about the city at every scale. So from things like hoarding design to workshops with the local community to kind of try and discover what a space can become, right the way up to sort of master planning of new cities. There's sort of room for design at all these different scales. And so, yeah, this is a pavilion I worked on a number of years ago for Clerkenwell Design Week, where we were using the opportunity of a small-scale temporary project to sort of test material that was traditionally used as a cladding as a structural material for the first time. And for the course of the design week, you know, we managed to test this material, but also create the space for the community to come and have workshops and use throughout the duration of the design week. So I suppose I'm really interested in how the smallest of interventions and design moves can really transform a space. And how do we do that in a way where we're creating frameworks for people to kind of take over, rather than kind of dictating how a space has to be used, kind of giving lots of different options and I suppose the power for citizens to kind of decide how they want to use their public space. And then this is another installation I did for the Oslo Architecture Triennale in 2019, where we were looking at mushrooms, mycelium, as a building material. And I think, again, this is something I love about these small scale temporary projects, that you can really test and push materials to understand what they can and can't do. And so this was looking at whether mycelium could be a material that we use within building that perhaps is more sustainable. And so one of the seats that we made sits inside the museum and one sits outside the museum. And then over the course of the Triennale, the one outside the museum sort of decayed in the rain. And it was a really interesting opportunity to look at the different ways that the mycelium kind of lent itself to these different environments. And then this is Battersea Art Centre, which Kate mentioned, which I worked on when I was at Howth Tompkins for a number of years. And something I love about this building, it's a grade 2 star listed building that sort of burnt to the ground. And when it burnt to the ground, we sort of read that, well, sorry, the roof burnt off and you can see all this charring. And often with a listed building, you're sort of forced to rebuild like for like. But because I think part of it was because we had a really good relationship with the client. And I really think buildings often are only as good as their clients. You know, it's a really, really important to have like a really integrated design team who works very well with the client. And the client sort of was really open to rethinking what this building could become and whether it was actually an opportunity to upgrade the space. And the local planning authority was similar. They were really on board with this. So externally, it was rebuilt like for like, but internally, we left all this fire staining and we sort of read it as a moment in the building's history that should be retained, and sort of, you know, it was really important actually and integral to the building's history. And then we created this kind of new timber lattice type ceiling structure, which has perforate holes in it, so then allows for theatre tech equipment to drop through it, which suddenly makes the space much more flexible. And so it was kind of understanding the ways that we could actually upgrade the space and taking that step, and I suppose that opportunity to rethink what the space needed to be used for rather than dictating how it should be used. And then something I'm really interested in is public space and infrastructure. And, you know, I think things like drinking fountains and benches and toilets, all these kind of network of infrastructure, which allows everyone to use the city on their own terms. And so this was a project I did a couple of years ago when I was at Studio Weave, which was looking at how we could create this network of drinking fountains in central London, which also became these wayfinding objects and sort of allowed for gathering spaces around them. And then this is a series of studies I did in Tokyo, which is a fascinating city for infrastructure projects, because sort of Tokyo is a very densely urbanized city. And suddenly, you know, you'll have this requirement for like a water sewage treatment plant, which means you'll need a mass expanse of space. And so they've taken the opportunity to actually build a park over this water treatment facility. And so it's kind of thinking about how can we make the kind of really, how can we make these really kind of engineering heavy projects actually work harder through design. And again, how a seawall to protect the city from flooding can become a place for allotments for people from local apartment blocks. A lot of that helped inform kind of my work on the National Infrastructure Commission, where I'm part of the design group. And last year we launched these 4 principles, which are to be used on every single nationally important infrastructure project across the country. And these are design principles that everyone should be thinking about, whether they're a designer, an engineer, clients. I suppose what we're trying to say is that everyone actually has a part to play in design, and you know, we are actually all sort of designers in our own way. And so those 4 principles are climate, people, places, value. And so, you know, always making sure that our projects are contributing to our climate crisis in a sort of positive way, or in fact not contributing to climate crisis, but, you know, bring down our carbon emissions and sort of biodiversity gains. That every single project is about people, that our projects are enhancing a sense of place, and then thinking about value, not just in terms of economic value, but also the kind of social value and the other types of value that a project can bring. And I suppose thinking about value is a much longer term thing than often it's thought about. And that's these are principles that we also brought into this project. I worked with some friends from the National Infrastructure Commission's Young Professionals panel, where we were looking at how we could transform sort of small railway stations across the UK by having these kind of modular structures, which then offered sort of roof landscaped gardens and with wildlife and biodiversity that people could also go up to and see, whilst also having the kind of very kind of amenity focused ticket office and coffee shops. And then I suppose my sort of biggest project, which is currently being shown at the moment in Venice, is for the British Pavilion, which I've been working on with Manoj Verghese. We've sort of co-curated this pavilion book together. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Venice Biennale, but sort of an architecture biennale which happens every other year, and it's sort of the biggest architecture festival in the world, and every single country sort of has its own pavilion, and this is the British Pavilion, which was originally a tea house and has sort of been colonized by the British, I suppose, which is a bit odd, but it sort of sits in these gardens in Venice. And we've curated this exhibition called The Garden of Privatized Delights. And for that exhibition, we took this triptych by Hieronymus Bosch, which we loved because it sort of sets up this sort of heaven and then hell, and then this middle ground in between. And our pavilion's exploring privatized public space. And we often felt that this is a debate that's very polarized, and often people think private evil, public goods. And then we're trying to say, well, actually, we're all living in this middle ground in between. And we sort of explored this through this collage that we did together when we were putting together the competition entry. And then so as you enter the Garden of Privatized Delights, as you enter the pavilion, you're sort of entering into that middle ground. You're entering into this weird kind of privatized public world that we're all living in, and starting to question, how do we actually open up these spaces so they're more inclusive and accessible, and how can the public and private sectors sort of work together? And as you enter, you immediately confront these railings, and you can see there's something going on behind, but you can't immediately access that. You're sort of forced to go around the whole pavilion until you find yourself back inside. And that's really setting up the issue of privatized public space, that often it's only accessible to those who have a key. So this is the kind of map of the pavilion. So you're sort of forced to go inside, firstly Publican, which is the pub, and then you go into the Ministry of Collective Data, then into the high streets, then another Ministry of Common Land, Play Without Grounds, and then you finally find yourself back in this Garden of Delights. So Publican, which is the pub, which has been designed by the decorators. And this is sort of looking at the future of the pub and how pubs are a really important kind of social centres. You know, they're more than just drinking and watering holes. And, you know, I think there are a number of studies out there actually showing that often where you see pubs closed down in rural communities, you'll see an increase in alcoholism, for example. And so how can we start to rethink the pub for the 21st century as something which is more than just a watering hole? And so this bar structure, it sort of drops to different heights to allow different people to come around the table, because pubs, you know, as well as being sort of communal centres, they can also be quite exclusive spaces, not always feel very inclusive. So how do we start to rethink that? And then you go into the Ministry of Collective Data, which is looking at sort of ownership of data and facial recognition technology. And it's looking at how the technology itself isn't necessarily inherently bad, but the way it's being used and applied is very bad. So are there ways actually that we could start to apply these sorts of data ownership, which is more collective and community owned, and what does that sort of lead us to? And are there ways that we could be using these technologies for public benefit rather than it always being owned by private companies, and also just the kind of lack of transparency over that ownership? And then you walk into the high street of exchanges, and that's really looking at the importance of the high street and how it's more than just a commercial centre. So for example, when you go and get your haircuts, you're getting more than just a haircut, you're also getting a conversation with someone, which can be really important, like, you know, especially for like elderly people like my grandma. It might be like her only conversation she has a week with someone. And so how do we start to retain these kind of uses on our high streets today? And then there's this middle, so these cones, they sort of play a soundscape from Sheffield high streets, and one of the soundscapes being recorded in this project called Sheffield Food Hall, which is a pay-as-you-feel project. So the food hall, they sort of collect sort of unused groceries from local supermarkets and cafes, which would otherwise be thrown out, and then they make meals from them, and anyone can come and you just pay whatever you can afford. So it really gets different people around a table. And then this the kind of relationship between sort of participant and volunteer is kind of blurred. And so it's really challenging, I suppose, the economies that we're living in, and how we can start to rethink the types of exchange we have. I suppose just you can see there's a receipt dispenser here at the other end, there's an ATM machine, and the idea is instead of dispensing money, this ATM dispenses advice, which comes out of this receipt dispenser. And then you enter into the Ministry of Common Land by Public Works, and that's really looking at citizens' assemblies and bottom-up approaches to land ownership, and how we can sort of allow sort of citizens' voices in looking at what the transformation of spaces in our cities. And so, you know, traditionally a ministry is sort of a very top-down space, and this is designed as quite like a circular space where it allows lots of different people around the table. And then into Play Without Grounds, which is looking at spaces for teenagers and young people, and how there just isn't anywhere in the city for teenagers to hang out in anymore. And often when there are spaces provided for them, they're for very active teenagers, like basketball courts or skateboarding ramps. But actually, a lot of teenagers, they just, I was definitely like this, I just wanted to sit around with my mates. So how do you actually provide spaces and frameworks for teenagers and young people to inhabit on their own terms without telling them what they have to do? And so this structure, it also plays like a soundscape of interviews with teenagers and young people from across the UK, talking about the types of spaces they would like to see in their city. But really, it's just allowing a sort of framework for them to inhabit on their own terms. And then finally, you find yourself back inside the Garden of Delight, and this time the railings have sort of been removed and repurposed in furniture around the room. It's looking at sort of how in World War II, a lot of the railings around garden squares were taken down and melted to be used for ammunition. They were never actually used for it, but what did happen was it meant a lot of garden squares were opened and people could meet on them for the first time from all different parts of society. And then after the wall, the railings were reinstated, a lot of the garden squares became private again. And it's really bizarre. I don't know how familiar you all are with London and sort of other Georgian cities around the UK, like Bath and other places, but essentially what happens is you have these amazing oases of green space right in the center of the city, but no, you can't enter them unless you're sort of a local resident with a key. And so you'll see, like where I studied at the Architectural Association, that's right next to a garden square called Bedford Square, and we'd all just eat lunch on the pavement or outside the square, and there'd be no one actually inside the square because none of us knew how to access the key. And so it's really looking at how can we start to open up these spaces and work with, I suppose, both people who live and work locally. Often they're in places that are actually no longer residential buildings even, and start to open up these spaces so everyone can use them for different activities like playing. There's a solar cooker around the corner, so cooking, growing things, gathering, and also places for contemplation, which are often really missing in a city. Like architects are sort of we love to create gathering spaces, but it's equally important to have sort of spaces to be alone in and just be and contemplate. And then finally, there's the toilets, which is our sort of surprise seventh room in the basement of the pavilion. So the British Pavilion is one of the few pavilions that actually has toilets in it. And we went over when they were installing the Art Biennale, and it's this real social hub because everyone's coming to use the toilets. And suddenly we realized how important toilets actually are in allowing access to our public space and cities and the freedom to access them on your own terms. And there's a real lack of public toilets in the UK, and it's been a big issue because increasingly there's actually no legislation to protect them, or there's no right for a council to provide them. And so often when councils lose funding, the toilets are one of the things that go. And then suddenly you're left with the kind of private sector to pick up the void. But, unless you feel comfortable crossing a threshold or buying a drink, you're suddenly excluded from using that toilet. But there are some really interesting schemes out there. Like in Sheffield, there's a scheme called the LAV scheme, which means any institution that displays a sticker in their window, it means you're welcome to come in and use a toilet. You don't need to purchase anything. And in King's Cross in London, there are some amazing new public toilets that have been provided by a private developer, but for anyone from the public to sort of come in and use. And so we're kind of really interested in that private-public, I suppose, role with the toilet, because often we think there's this sort of nostalgia for when the public sector had loads of funding, and actually they just don't have the funding right now to provide it. So how do we therefore sort of not force developers, but get the private sector to recognize, I suppose, that they have a responsibility to also work with the public sector to provide certain amenities. And then if you want to find out more about this, there's loads more kind of information on the British Council's website. If you just Google the Garden of Privatized Delights. And we'll be launching soon like a 3D scan of the exhibition, or if you can go out to Venice, it's on until the end of November. But yeah, it's really, I suppose, to sum up the exhibition, it's really trying to bring different people around the table, from local communities to developers to politicians to architects, and get them to sort of look at how we can work together to open up our privatized public spaces and make it more accessible, rather than constantly working in these silos where perhaps we do actually have aligned visions, but we're often not really working together.
Brilliant.
So yeah, thank you.
So, I mean, I'm very interested in this, especially with that point that we said right at the beginning about empathy being the beginning of everything. So in your experience, I mean, this is dealing with a very clear part of a city. What do you think is that relationship between citizens and the places that you've been describing, and how do you empathize with those people to make sure it kind of works for them?
Yeah, I think the empathy thing is actually super important, because I think often architects have gotten a bit of a bad rap because we've not really taken that step to understand a place, and no one knows a place like the people who live there. And so I think it's really important to work with local people to really understand a place, what might be missing from a place, how can design transform a place. And sort of with Battersea Arts Centre, for example, that was like a 10-year project where we were working with the building and the local community through loads of different types of performances and workshops to understand what this building could become. And I think there's a thing called community consultation, which often happens on projects, and you need to do to get through planning, and it's often done in a very tick box way. And what happens is there'll be loads of sort of A1 boards put up, like in a community centre or something, saying what's going to happen in that development, and it's a load of sort of visuals and renderings, but it's almost like it's a step too far. So much has already happened, so many decisions have already been made. And I think it's much more interesting to actually work with communities in terms of testing what spaces can become. So through performances, through sort of the benchmaking workshop I showed, like if you have a consultation with people where you're making things like a collage or a bench or things like that, you get very different conversations than when you're just asking what do you want to see in your local area. If you ask what do you want to see, you're already kind of channeling the conversations, whereas if you're actually just learning and working with people, and I think that's where sort of social scientists can be really important in the kind of discussion as well, because as architects we don't have those kind of skills, and so I do think it's about bringing all these different people together to really understand communities and empathize.
And in fact, that's interesting, even in the notion of what we're talking about today in terms of tools. I think often people are almost trying to solve the problem before it even reaches the user. And it's more about, exactly like you're doing, thinking about creative ways that you might unlock questions you haven't even thought to ask yet, in order to then build something more refreshing and useful. And in terms of those principles that you've developed, the 4 principles, how did you, from a kind of practical sense, how did you find yourself using those, maybe with the example of Venice? From your experience, how do you then end up actually applying and meeting such huge topics within one program?
So those principles, they obviously, I think like everything in design and probably in life, it was a very iterative process to come up with them. And we knew we wanted to have some kind of design principles to make everyone realize and understand that whatever they're doing on a project, they're actually influencing the design. And the reason I got involved with the National Infrastructure Commission was because I was getting really frustrated working on projects where I was like, who has even made these decisions? Like it's, I've come on board so late in the process, so many decisions have already been made. And I think what we want to do was get like people who are involved in like strategic decision making and policy making and all of that side of things, just to understand that actually every decision they're making has a huge implication on the design later down the line. So it's about getting people to think about design from the earliest stages, rather than thinking about it as this bolt-on and this add-on. And the NIC did loads of research where they found that often people think that if you think about design too early, or you get designers on board too early, your project will lead to loads of time delays, it will overrun on cost. But actually the evidence is to the contrary. On the projects where you get designers in earlier, that's more likely to come in on time and to budget, because you prevent a lot of the, if you solve those issues early on, you prevent a lot of the kind of issues later down the line. And so with the design principles, we didn't want to just create like another checklist that everyone's having to tick off. And also we had a lot of conversations about, if you create sort of design standards, so like in London, you've got the London housing standards. What ends up happening is everyone designs to the minimum standard. We didn't want to just have a minimum standard that everyone is designing to. And then we spoke about whether maybe we should have like a maximum standard, but then how, you just want that to be so aspirational. And then we just thought that these were 4 very simple ideas that hopefully people can start to just embody in everything they're doing. So every decision they're taking, just making sure they're really considering these 4 kind of really core principles as they go along.
Great. Well, one of those principles was value. So that was the final principle, and you mentioned already that sort of definition of value is key. It could be economic, it could be social, and actually that sort of leads us on to the challenge that we wanted to set together today. And And I will flag, we have plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you've got burning questions for Madeleine, hold tight and we will come back to them. But just on that then, so I'm just going to share my screen because I want to explain a few things about what we're going to work on. Bear with me, where's my share screen? Here it is. Fab. Right, so this idea about value. So we were thinking about that, and we were thinking what is a kind of practical tool that we could all apply today to really unpick that idea of value, and sort of really having listened to Madeleine's experience in the world of architecture and thinking about your own fields, really letting all those different sort of experiences and disciplines apply here. But Madeleine and I were thinking about this notion of indexes. And Maddie, I think you were mentioning the World Happiness Index. I think it was you that mentioned that one. You know, that typically countries are defining themselves by, you know, gross domestic product and financial return and, you know, the bottom line. But
I think it was, yeah, we were talking about so in New Zealand, I think because actually New Zealand had a really big issue with sort of male suicide and things like that, and Jacinda Ardern, just like her and her team, they sort of took a step back to be like, you know, actually what are the indexes we should be measuring our country by, and they sort of brought in this happiness index, and I think it just shows how all these different things are related.
Yeah. And I think also, you know, there's a World Happiness Report that the UN does every year, and it's great. You know, it really does dive into an awful lot of detail about what is valuable to people from a well-being perspective. So beyond money, access to education, access to healthcare, you know, work-life balance, support with childcare. It's, you know, it's a really interesting perspective. And what's also interesting when you look at these different indexes is which countries and communities and locations are at the top of the list and the bottom of the list. And from my feeling, that's all about perspective. You know, you might define one country as successful in one way, and in another way it's very unsuccessful, and then that raises lots more questions about, you know, what problems should you be solving and how can you work together in that way. So we thought as an exercise it would be interesting for you to come up with an index. So the idea here is to try and think of an item, a part of society or a part of community that you think is really vital. So what, you know, what is something that either you personally or a community that you've observed, or, you know, actually you could put yourself in someone else's shoes and think of something entirely different, but just pick an example, city or community, and think of one thing that's super important to that group of people. It's helpful to actually try and kind of pinpoint a place or a location just to kind of give you a hook to work from, and then think creatively about how you might measure that value. So, you know, the World Happiness Index, when you get into it, they have selected a lot of different criteria, and, you know, they've also then got to figure out how on earth they're going to go and collect that data. So we want you to be a bit creative with this. This is where that kind of collage, you know, anything's a good idea, fun moment might come in. But it could be, you know, it could be absolutely anything. So what sprung to my mind is, you know, we've just ended our summer holidays. If you were trying to make an index that defined how successful people's summer holidays are, maybe you might do it by trying to calculate how many ice creams were sold on beaches across Europe. Maybe ice cream is a defining part of happiness on a holiday. Or maybe for you, happiness on a summer holiday is actually miles that you walked, you know, so maybe it's about an index of how far people walked on their summer holidays. So if you see what I mean, we kind of want to be a bit playful, and it's not the outcome that we're worried about, it's the process and the kind of discussion that you could come up with. So we're really trying to get you to think up, you know, specifically just one creative way that you might measure that value, or what your scale is. Obviously, if you're on a roll, come up with a few different ones, that's fine. The whole point is to come back together, and we want to hear from you your example, and we're then going to kind of work together to kind of unpick that. And really our end goal is to think about the way that Madeleine has approached her work and all of those brilliant design principles. How might we use something like an index in our own careers and our own lives in order to help us be empathetic and measure things effectively? And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of feedback and effective evaluation at that point as well. So does everyone get that? What we're going to do is we are just going to sort of pop everybody in breakout rooms randomly. I'm going to stay out here in the main room. So if at any point you don't know what you're doing and you just want a quick steer, come back out into the main room and I'll happily help you. But like we said, nothing is a bad idea. Really try and go with your gut instincts. And if in doubt, if you find yourselves getting a bit too detailed, just make a real quick decision together, because otherwise you'll end up spending ages kind of really thinking about which town you're modeling this in, and you won't have any time to come up with your fun ice cream examples. Madeleine and I will stay out here. So if you've got any thoughts, if you even need just a bit of a creative idea, we're both here ready, full of ideas, but hopefully we can leave these up to you as well. So just while I'm starting to put people into breakout rooms, if you've got any questions, please just put up your hand and I can help answer them.
I'd also add, I think there's just nothing, like there's no right or wrong about what you're interested in as well. Like everything is important. So don't be shy. You know, I think if you're really interested in something, please do bring it to the table.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. Because that's precisely that. We can really learn from each other. So we're probably actually just going to have I will be mean. I'll put us into small groups, because that way you can probably have better conversations. Sorry, just bear with me. I'm going to do it automatically. And if you've got anyone in your room that just has already stepped out, then just come out and let me know. If it's only like one of you in the room, just let me know, because I'm just doing it automatically. Assign automatically 3 rooms. Okay, so hopefully you'll have rooms appearing in front of you now, and I'll give you some reminders. We're only going to spend about 10 to 12 minutes on this, so really just sort of dive in, come up with quick questions for your group, and I'll also put in the chat now. Sorry, just bear with me one moment. I'm just going to try and put in the chat these questions for you, because then you'll have them when you go into your rooms, and that will be helpful for you as well. Here we go. So in your chat now, you should have the kind of prompts for you to use. Brilliant. I'll call you back in about sort of 12 minutes and we will dive in with Madeleine to have a think about these indexes. So everyone got that popping up? Yeah, brilliant. You're all going in the rooms now. It's fab. Great.
I've got something saying to join room 1. Should I?
No, it probably
that's fine. I'm gonna run to the loo. I'll be back in the.
See you in a moment. Welcome back. Hi, Bora. Okay, everyone is coming back. Thank you so much. It's always bizarre being outside of those rooms because I don't know whether I'm interrupting an in-depth conversation or whether you're all done and happy, but I feel hopefully that was good. Got some smiles on faces, that's great. So for the next part then, we're desperate to hear your ideas, and then Madeleine and I will sort of work with you to kind of talk through them and think about them in the context of this idea of value and empathy and how you might apply these in your own work. So if I can just ask one person from every group or yourselves together, if you feel more comfortable, just to kind of feedback some of your thoughts. I'm going to be taking notes so we can then kind of visualize it. So the first group I had down was Darmin and Gemini. Do you mind just one of you unmuting and telling us what you came up with?
Do you want to go on, Dama?
Sure, I can do that. So we were thinking in terms of the index, just in light of recent events.
Oh, sorry, you've gone on mute again, Daman.
Oh, sorry. So we were thinking in terms of women going missing in London, the safety of women. So the index we wanted to look at making was safety of women in public spaces in London. And the conversation, what came up was that what makes women feel safer in places is seeing other women around them. And I think Zenji mentioned how they created these women-only transportation buses, which actually didn't really help because that makes you feel unsafe when you're in environments where, it just makes it actually more hard to travel. So some of the ways to measure this, we were thinking for a city would be number of women on the streets, a number of public transportation points, the visibility of these transportation, how safe they feel, the structure of the location, what it looks like, does it have lighting, does it have cameras or street cameras, also public announcements on call this number or helplines. If they're written all over, that makes you feel, the predator also think twice and you feel safe as well. So yeah, and another solution we thought of was a button for help, where if you're unsafe, a train has that pulling thing, or there's other places which have some sort of a safety equipment. So if you press a button, it kind of makes someone call out for help. So yeah, those were some of the things we came up with.
Amazing. What an incredible index to come up with, and such creative in a short amount of time. I mean, can you imagine? That would just be so incredibly useful in a number of different cities. Actually, you've kind of jumped ahead there with the solution, which is where we want to get to. So that's a really interesting. So you've kind of gone through this process where you've identified that is a key moment of value. A solution that you might prototype and test is some sort of, I suppose, a button on an app, perhaps, something that's kind of or makes a kind of loud noise to kind of draw attention to somebody and kind of scare off anyone that's being predatory. One of my thoughts is, so on a practical sense, the community that you're looking to serve is women in general. So is that right? Yeah. So is there anyone else that you think would find this useful? Any other part of society that when you have that index ready, it might help them to understand their own perspective or work? I mean, the one that's immediately coming to my mind is the emergency services. They would find that incredibly helpful.
I mean, this might not be, but I think parents, or even spouses, or anyone, actually family members, it's at least for, I come from the developing world where there are inhibitions to let women out of into public spaces because of these particular reasons. So anyone, I think family members, or it's society in general, but I think parents as well, especially sending young girls out, or husbands, or family members, that comes to mind as well.
Yes, really interesting. So something as relatively simple as having an alarm, say, if we go with that prototype, could actually help equality, because it would mean people feel more free to let women out. They feel that they'll be safe. That's really interesting. Madeleine, what are your thoughts? What immediately comes to your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an amazing index, I think, to have like a safety index. And yeah, I think also then, like Kate's saying, like the implications then on all the other kind of services and the rest of the community will be incredible. I think the thing that immediately comes to mind for me is from a design perspective, how that can start, we can maybe start to incorporate some really cool kind of design principles into the safety of our streets. So you mentioned lighting like being a really important thing. Like, you know, if an area is not lit very well, then you get higher crime rates. So, you know, maybe we'd bring in things like that, but also overlooking. So where you have lots of sort of windows from people's homes overlooking a place. The classic is when you have people's kitchens where they're doing the washing up and they can overlook into a space. That tends to start to make an area just feel that much safer. If everything is just like a blank facade without any windows, then, you know, you've not got any of that kind of, it's called passive surveillance just by the community. And maybe just sort of as well, how do we actually sort of, you know, create sense of community a bit more so that people actually sort of look out for one another and, you know, check that each other are okay. Our cities have been sort of designed as quite lonely spaces. I think traditionally we sort of had these kind of communal areas for people to just bump into one another and get to know one another. You get to know your neighbours. But increasingly we're kind of living in quite kind of isolated ways. So are there ways we can just kind of force those kind of interactions, which are really important to sort of happen more? And there's something called Lendlease's Loneliness Lab, which is really looking into that. Actually, how do we actually design our cities to be, they're looking at it to be less lonely, so you get to know one another. But I think if you also got to know one another, it would actually make a space feel safer. So yeah, I think it's a super interesting one.
And one of my thoughts is can you think of anywhere where you've already seen this being successful, or where you think it would be implemented pretty easily? Is there someone that comes to mind, and anyone can answer this, where you think you might have seen an index of that kind working, or a tool of that kind actually happening?
The only thing that comes to my mind is the first time I was in London. I used the public toilets at the London Underground station, and when you close the door, there is a sticker that says you can call for Angela or something like this if you are on like a bad date or if someone is following you or something. And that just felt very safe for me, because also I come from a very small country that is like a developing country, and we don't even have like visible structures, for example, on the bus stations. So that was something that really like made me feel a bit safer. So it's a bit similar. It's not similar to the alarm thing, but something that reminds me of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, ask for Angela. I see it all everywhere across the UK, and it always makes me just feel very reassured. Even it's even in a place I feel very safe. It's just even the notion that someone has taken the time to put up that sticker, train the bar staff to know what to be asked for. I think it's such an interesting exercise. It clearly is working. And I suppose the other one that comes to my mind similarly was when they in Edinburgh. I don't know how many of you know Edinburgh, but there's a big stretch called the Meadows, which links a very popular residential area with students and the university. And historically, it was dark at night, and particularly in Scotland, it gets super dark for most of the year. And there were a lot of attacks and really horrible things happening. And they simply put lighting in. They put lighting in the central street, and they had a police patrol more regularly going around, and suddenly everyone sort of re-owned the night. And I've walked across those meadows many times in the middle of the night with my friends, feeling perfectly safe. So their lighting comes into play. Fabulous, thank you. I can't wait to get that index up and running. I think group decision. Yeah.
So I think the best safe making, I think I can tell that parameters is in the city. Maybe it's the only the citizens. When we have some other people around there, maybe in the public space in the street, or even when we have windows that open to the space, we have shops that are open, shops that have visitors someone commuting in there, that would be naturally be safe, and maybe in some situations presence of the police and some safety equipments would be more stressful for the residents. Maybe it's alarm for some lack of safety, but residence itself would be more safe making for the situation, and make that space naturally and more maybe sustainably more, it would be more safe space. Thank you.
Yeah, a bit kind of you know, community watch sort of approach to things, everyone looking out for one another. Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that example. Right, I would love to hear the next one, because then we're going to look at it all as a kind of whole together. So the next group I think we had was Matthew, Kwame, and Rasha. Was it you as well, the three of you together? If one of you wouldn't mind nominating yourselves or collectively telling us what you came up with.
Okay, I guess I'll go. Matthew came up with a great idea that we need public space everywhere, and with COVID and people being home during lockdown, we obviously see that public spaces are very important. Rasa came up with the great idea to the way you really measure public space is through the way that people connect with nature and other people, which is essentially how do we connect with life. And Rasa has experience. He is a landscape architect. So I think that he said that the best way to really test it is to actually observe to the way the people react to the environment that they're in, because it's hard to really quantify it with an actual questionnaire, because everybody experienced an environment in a different way. Arasa, I don't know if you want to add.
Thank you. Yes, that was a complete explanation of what we discussed, and we think we need we need to keep some sort of distance from the situation, but we observe the behavior of the people and watch the sort of activities and diversity that happens in the space. Diverse people from the genders, from the ages, and from the every situations that they have would increase the connectivity of the people to each other, social connectivity and natural connectivity. That would be the key to make a live public space and make it more creativity for the activity that a city can provide for its citizens.
Amazing. Yeah, I love that. And what I like about this actually, and Madeleine, I might bring you in on this, is the fact it's sort of deliberately a little bit more abstract. You know what's important to people, but it's not about writing a questionnaire or like you were describing, the kind of community consultation thing where you just put up a sign and expect people to react. It's more about observing What in your work, Madeleine, how have you ended up tackling something like that, where it is a little bit more intuitive and objective, I suppose? How have you approached that?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Like, it's so important to think about these issues which aren't quite as quantitative as people like to think about. And I suppose that's what we're trying to look at with these indexes as well. You know, how do you actually, how can you actually quantify happiness, or how can you actually quantify safety? Or, you know, I love this idea of sort of like a nature and well-being kind of index. And it's like, how do you actually start to quantify these things? And whether perhaps it's about us all needing to also take a step back to think less in terms of like numbers and hardcore kind of figures, but maybe we need to be able to start to kind of measure things a bit more kind of qualitatively. And whether it is about having these kind of maximum aspirational standards that we're reaching towards or something, maybe it's about having sort of statements or ways that people kind of, you know, is there a way to have an index about people feeling welcome somewhere? Or how do you actually measure inclusivity and accessibility? And it's really interesting, the Greater London Authority last year, they produced a draft public space charter, first one of its kind in the world. And it's trying to set out a whole load of rules and regulations that every privatized public space in the UK has to obey. Because often you don't know you're on these spaces until you sort of break the rules. So they're like, well, we need like a similar set of standards. And it's sort of got these 12, I think it's 12 criteria. And they're things like making sure every single space is free to use, making sure every single space is open to all. And maybe it's about having sort of like a charter or something, like a sort of set of aspirational goals that, you know, is like a common set of standards that people have to sign up to or something. Maybe it's not about having a ranking out of 10. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a really important point about, again, this process is questioning the process itself. You know, we say index, we think of a scale. It doesn't have to be a scale at all. And that's sort of your right to kind of play around with it and work out what works for you. I mean,
sorry, Kate, can I add something?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
I guess I'd just like to mention sort of where the idea came from. So it was from, so I come from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and there's a lot of, it's a very nice city on sort of the coast, you can say. So lots of beaches and stuff like that. And what I see, I guess, is that like a lot of the beaches are actually behind a paywall. So you sort of have to sort of pay a sort of hotel entrance, and that's where you get the best maintained beaches. And the sort of public access beaches, which are like not that well maintained, actually do have a lot of people coming in regardless. So, you know, people clearly want to use the space, but they sort of don't have the means to go to the well-maintained beaches. So I guess I'd just like to mention the context behind it sort of firsthand.
I like that a lot. And from that example, then, if we were just to sort of go with that, is, so say you've managed to do a sort of observation index and you're seeing how people are interacting with those beaches. What might be a trial that could be used to perhaps then break down that paywall and make sure that people that are on the free beaches get as good an experience as the paid beaches? You know, is there an instinct that you have about how you could use an index or a process like this to get to that end goal?
I don't know. I guess I can't think of anything sort of off my head, but I guess since sort of thinking back to that context, there's a lot of sort of private developers who want to sort of build up those areas. And I guess the government doesn't really want to sort of put the funding into that. And I feel that maybe one way you could get the government to sort of develop these beaches is that, okay, trial an area, and then, you know, obviously there'll be like, you know, small businesses who, you know, have the space to actually conduct their business. And, you know, you'd actually have, I don't know, I guess income in a way. You would stimulate the business environment, if that's a word. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. Because some of this, you know, might involve having to actually, you know, make a business case, even though that might not feel right, but it's, you know, something about your observation might help then move that forward. Darman, you've got your hand up. Come in, join us.
Hi, this is something I've discussed with another friend actually, so I thought I'll just put the point across, but a friend of mine was mentioning she was, vacationing in Europe, and similar beaches which are reserved for private viewers only. But the public spaces in those cases are just so limited. Someone without resources is then just limited to, you go to places in your beaches in Europe, and unless you're paying it's almost like businesses have ownership of the beach. You have to pay £5 to be sitting on a chair, and if you don't do that, you have like no access. I think that's problematic as well, where public spaces need to be available for everyone, and if you're not of a certain level, or if you don't have a certain level of income, you're not able to participate. That's quite problematic. So I think that needs to be taken into account as well. Whereas I do see the case of, the importance of maintenance as well. But I think there's a need for a middle ground there somewhere so that everyone has access.
Yeah, I think sorry. And it's really relevant. It's so similar to the kind of topics we're exploring in the pavilion in Venice, like, looking at why is there unequal access to land, and it's similar in the UK as well. You'll be walking along the beach and suddenly something's private and you have to like go on a really roundabout route. And it's looking at things like in Edinburgh, in Scotland, they have the right to roam, for example, so you're allowed to walk across bits of private land. And I think what we found in the pavilion, when we've been talking particularly to landowners of sort of garden squares about why we can't open those up to the public, it's sort of addressing the fears, like why are people so scared to open up bits of private land for everyone to use, and whether it's about sort of taking, I guess it's the empathy thing, right? It's also listening to those people and then testing with them different ways for other people to start to use these spaces, and then showing to them that actually it can be really beneficial to have lots of different people using those spaces. And there are different ways as well that why are we always thinking about things in terms of financial transactions? Why can't it be that if you help to maintain or care, like if you're watering some plants, that's also a way, for example, for these garden squares to survive. And I wonder if there's kind of a similar thing with the beaches, like whether it's about just rethinking the economy of them, sort of really thinking about why are the people who are using these private beaches so scared to open them up to the public? Like, what are the real issues? And some of them probably are like reasonable things to be scared about, and some aren't. Some will just be kind of mythical. So I think it's about bringing different people together, and like you're saying, recognizing this as an issue. It's a real issue, because as soon as you start to do this, you start to make people feel like they're not welcome. And if you're making people feel like they're not welcome in their own cities, then you start to get all sorts of issues and problems. And so, it just spirals. So I think it's a really, really important one. It's a great, great topic.
And I think what's really interesting about both the examples we've had already, and we'll move on to our last one, is that even just this process of talking for 10 minutes has unlocked this kind of really interesting thoughts on big social issues, but actually trying to get it down into something relatively achievable that you could trial, which is part of the point. So just mindful of time, so I'm going to pass on to our last group so that we have a little bit of a moment at the end to kind of bring together some of our thoughts for actions. So I think we had last group. Would one of you mind? Oh, sorry, I'm not sure if I froze.
Sorry, I think you froze.
I think I froze. I thought it wasn't. Silke and Bora, would one of you mind sharing your last example?
Sika can go on. She has an interesting one.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So Bora came up with sewage system that's very important in the city. She mentioned that she measures the how good a sewage system in the city by how I'm sorry, by how it's like how ready it is to receive the water from the households and the rain when it comes to a rainy season. And actually I have a story about the sewage system in my country, because my country is an underdeveloped countries. So when the rainy season comes, it's the same time that the dengue fever, the dengue fever disease is coming into the town also. Because a poor sewage system can lead to a lot of new problems like health problem and just a lot of social problems. But I want to highlight the health problem that is the results of a poor sewage system. So in Indonesia, when the rain season comes, a lot of sewage and canals here are clogged and it's filled up with water, and the water doesn't go anywhere, so it becomes a new habitat for a bacteria, algae, and mosquitoes. So mosquitoes is the source of a lot of health issues, like the one I mentioned, dengue fever. So I think I agreed with Bora that as a good sewage system is very important in a city, because without a good sewage system, it can actually leads to a lot of new problems. Bora, if you wanted to add anything.
Thank you, Sigal. I would like just to add that about the measurement side of a good sewage system. We said that, for example, especially in small cities, in small communities, we could measure it by seeing how clear the water is. If kids, for example, would swim in the river, and if people would fish in the water. In the river. So because the case was something vital, and we both came from developing countries, and I think a sewage system is something vital for normal life.
And I like this because that is such a very practical, measurable thing you can do. Exactly, do people fish? People will know if it's going to not be a great place to fish, and do the kids play in the water? I think that's a really, really interesting one. Madeleine, I can see you've already shared a great success story with this, the Tideway.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a brilliant one. When I was a student for my diploma project, I sort of repurposed an old factory to create a sewage system which had different kind of activities for the public to do as the water got cleaner, to also kind of educate the public on the cleanliness of their water. And as part of that was using like different plants and fish and things like that. And I think, like you're saying, like it's something that's really important, but how do we sort of make it sort of quite visible as well, so that people understand that importance? Because I think often with these issues, a bit like the toilet and the pavilion, these are really important societal issues, but people shy away from them because they're not very sexy to discuss. And everyone would much rather like talk about the kind of cleaner, nicer things. But actually, these are the most important issues, because these are the issues that really allow people to function and use the city. And I love the examples you posted as well, because they're really beautiful, like these kind of caps the crafting of the caps and stuff. And I think in the UK, especially, like Victorian England used to do that really well. We've now kind of lost that craft and kind of the appreciation and the importance of these bits of our cities. And I think it's a really, really important one to have. And I'd be really fascinated to see the kind of sewage system index across the world and how it varies. But also think about, how do we actually measure it? Like, is it literally about the cleanliness of the water in the sewage, or is it also about the additional benefits we can create with these systems? Can they create new public spaces like the Tideway that I posted in the chat? So London, we've been using a sewage system which is centuries old, and it's just not adequate. So every time there's a really big storm, all the stormwater and sewage mixes and it just goes into the Thames River. And as a result, like everything died in the Thames River. Like there were no fish in there until a few years ago, when there was an active effort to clean it up. and the capacity of the sewage system just doesn't, it was built for like 1 million or 2 million people, and now we're a city of 8 million. And so there's been a huge effort now to build these huge super sewers. It's a really huge project. And as part of that, it's also been an opportunity to create new parks in the city where you've got to have these kind of huge caps going into the grounds and stuff. So I just think that these are really important kind of infrastructural questions, which also have another layer. We can always push them to go further and add even more to our urban environments.
So this is fantastic. And what I've just been doing while you've all kindly been sharing those examples, just summarizing these for us, we will be turning this into a bit of a toolkit, like I said. Hopefully this is going to load in a second. There you go. And I think one of the reflections I really want you to kind of have as you walk away is just, who'd have thought that we would have ended up thinking about these 3 completely different subjects, in 2 hours together. I think some of the, we said that part of the process is really trying to think about action. And some of the actions that I've heard from you and from Madeleine already today, that point you've just made, Madeleine, is trying to see how you can make design and places work harder. What is the multi-purpose of whatever you're working on? How else could it be applied? And that a lot of this is coming from empathy, really getting to grips with the community you're working with. And I think what I've also heard from you all is this idea that perhaps it doesn't have to be, sometimes there is a place for an index, like a really specific scale, and sometimes there is space for principles that can open things up and guide us that maybe aren't as fixed in place. And I think this is a really important thing to reflect upon, is often in our own disciplines, we're sort of told this is how you need to do things. And it's about giving yourselves permission to think, what's the tool that would actually help me right now? And where can I look for tools elsewhere or examples elsewhere, and sort of play with that in a way that's actually going to help the people that I'm working with. Madeleine, what are your final thoughts? What have you kind of walked away with of kind of actions that people might take forward?
I think there's just something that's just popped into my head as you were talking, Kate, that like with these indexes as well, it's like, how do we actually think creatively to get there? And so I think there's a fantastic example in Tirana in Albania, where there was a new mayor that came in called Edi Rahman a few years ago. I don't know if you guys know this, but he was an artist by training and background, and he came into this role and there was no money to do anything. They had really high crime rates. And what he recognized was actually very cheaply, he painted all the buildings sort of in the city centre, just painted them really, really colourful colours. And that ignited like a sense of civic pride, and the crime rates like dropped. Suddenly people were paying their taxes. I think there's been huge tax avoidance and stuff. And I just think like, how can we actually think creatively to achieve the other indexes as well? I think is a really, really interesting one. And I think that's something that's really come out of the conversation today. I've absolutely loved all your different thoughts on these indexes, and also I think how there's so much common ground between all the different countries that we're living in and we're familiar with. We seem to all be kind of grappling with the similar issues, and therefore how can we sort of work together and learn from one another, and especially in a world where it feels like we're increasingly isolationist. How can we actually reject that and come together to try and improve our urban environments?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'd love to, we'll sort of collect up all of these examples and make sure you've got them in your follow-up deck as well, because obviously this is just a taster. This is just meant to be a moment of inspiration, for you all and with you all. We've got a couple of minutes left. Has anyone got any thoughts that have occurred to them, any questions that they want to ask the group while they're together? I'd be interested to hear if there's something that you think you're actually going to walk away and try in your own practice. Has anyone got anything that they want to sort of put a hand up and share?
In terms of the public transport, making it safer for women, it made me think more of how can I do something about it back home. And actually back home is Albania, and I was smiling now that you mentioned the example because the buildings that were painted were communist buildings, and they were considered as a space that was kind of left behind, because when communism fell, everything was considered as bad, everything that was related to communism, even the architecture. So when he painted the buildings and added, like, there is this very famous building now that he painted some arrows that direct through to the center of the city, and that is now very lively space. It gave the space another meaning for the people. But yeah, I think the public transportation, it made me think more of in terms of how can this be a solution for back home. Here it's an issue as well, but back home is a bit of a more of an issue.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really interesting to hear that. Matthew, you've got your hand up.
I just wanted to ask a question to Madeleine, just in regards to her earlier presentation. I remember you sort of talking about private and public space, and then you had said that it's not that black or white. Can you sort of like expand on that? Just wanted to know what you meant.
Yeah, so I think often when you're walking in a city, you don't actually know who owns the land you're walking on, particularly in London. There's a really good website I recommend called Who Owns England, and it documents all the land ownership across the UK, or across England and Wales. And what that shows is there's loads of land that's not even documented. Like, it's really difficult to find out who owns the land, which is a really big issue, because if you're like a local community and you recognize there's a bit of land in your local area that's just not being used, and you want to start using it for something like a playground or allotments, how do you actually get that conversation going if you don't even know who to approach? And I suppose we're really interested in that lack of transparency over land ownership, and the fact that often you don't know that you're on a piece of private land until you break the rules. So there's a good example in 2011, there were these protests called the Occupy protests in London, and they took place in a square called Paternoster Square right next to St Paul's Cathedral, which I think many people thought was public space, but it turned out it was actually privately owned by the Mitsubishi Estate Company, and the people protesting were told they weren't allowed to protest there, and they sort of ushered on. And it sort of starts to become really scary when you're not allowed to do what you think is sort of like almost like a human right. And increasingly in the UK anyway, like, public land is being sold off. So increasingly the public spaces that we all use, they are privately owned, and so there's this really blurred boundary between private and public space, and I think what we were really interested in is looking at how we therefore work with that blurred boundary to ensure that our privately owned public spaces are still accessible, that they are inclusive, and that they don't become these kind of gated developments which only certain people can use. And often when this topic's discussed, people are just like, oh, the private sector is awful, we can't work with them. And actually we're trying to say, well, actually, you talk to the private sector, and a lot of the time the goals are aligned. Like, they also want to have spaces which are kind of welcoming, and they understand the importance of having lots of people use these different types of spaces, but perhaps they don't understand how to do that because everyone's sort of working in these silos. So if we bring everyone around the table together, that's when we can start to really have these conversations about how we make them more accessible. And I think that's what I found really interesting about your beach example. It sounds like it's lots of people operating in silos, like, this is our exclusive beach development, and then this is the development which, this is the bit of land we'll give to everyone else. But actually, if you got everyone around one table to talk about how can we make this work for everyone, I think that's when you start to create really exciting and unique spaces in the city, which will probably be much more successful than either on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Madeleine, for all of your inspiring examples today, including that one, and for everybody taking part. This is very much a group effort. Some people often make it feel like it's a bit kind of therapeutic, getting a moment to kind of talk to each other and share ideas. As I said, this is one of 4 of these sessions that we're doing this week. Very kindly, Madeleine is coming back on Wednesday to join us with Amma Kadal, who's going to be our guest speaker. We have a number of different speakers. You can find them on the LSE listings that you joined in, and also on Eventbrite. I've also shared everyone's sort of @s in the social media there in the chat. And of course, thank you very much to LSE Generate, LSE Cities and Manifesta for hosting today's session. We will get in touch at the end of the week with the follow-up toolkit for you to use, and please do keep in touch. We'd love to find out how this was helpful and hear about what you're working on. So thank you again, and hopefully we'll see you later on this week. Thanks everyone.
Thank you all. It was such an enjoyable morning. Thank you all.